In the spring of 2019, a University of Nebraska extension agronomist named Dale Pruitt stood at the front of the Nemaha County Meeting Hall in Auburn, Nebraska, and said that what Vera Holst was doing out on her family's 180 acres was, in his considered opinion, sentimentality dressed up as a farming system. He said it with the patient, slightly tired courtesy of a man who has spent 20 years correcting people who should know better. He gestured at a slide behind him, projected yield curves and input cost models, and fuel efficiency ratios per acre, and he said that while he understood the emotional pull of heritage practices, a working farm in the 21st century had to be evaluated on numbers. And the numbers said that draft horse tillage could not compete with modern diesel equipment. There were perhaps 40 farmers in that room. Several of them nodded. A few looked at the woman in the second row, the one in the canvas field duster with the wide, flat hands resting on her knees, to see how she would take it. Vera Holst looked at the slide for a moment. Then she looked at the window. 4 years later, in July of 2023, an operations director for the Prairie Heritage Grain Cooperative drove his truck down Vera's lane and sat at her kitchen table with a price sheet and a quality certification. He read her a number. The number was $8.40 per bushel. When he was done reading it, she asked him to read it again. She netted $62,400 on 180 acres that year, with no fuel bill for field work, no herbicide account, and no debt service on equipment. Her neighbor to the east, who farmed 320 acres with a late-model diesel tractor, netted less than $18,000 on twice the ground. And Dale Pruitt, who drove out that October to see what she had grown, stood at the edge of her field for a long time before he asked her quietly if she would walk him through how it worked. Let me tell you what 4 years looked like between those two moments, because the distance between a snide label and a quiet question is the real story here. Vera Holst was 64 years old in the spring of 2019, and she had been working the same 180 acres in Nemaha County for nearly 40 of those years. She was known in that part of the county for two things: an almost physical discomfort with unnecessary speech and her Belgians. She kept 6 of them, the team her father Emmett had built across the 1960s and 1970s, when every other farmer in the township was selling their draft horses to the rendering man and writing checks to implement dealers. Emmett Holst had died in 1987 and left Vera a paid-off quarter section, a farmall tractor she used mainly for hay baling and road travel, and a worn green ledger in which he had tracked his own costs and his neighbor's costs going back to 1955. On the inside front cover, in his narrow, unhurried handwriting, he had written one sentence: "A horse eats what you grow. A diesel engine eats what you buy. One of these you can control." Vera kept that ledger in the kitchen drawer by the telephone. She had not bought a new tractor since 1983. She had not sprayed a herbicide pass since 1997. What she had done every spring for nearly 4 decades was bring Burl out of the barn in the cold early light and harness him first, because he was the lead horse and the oldest, a bay Belgian gelding of 16.5 hands with a chest like a church door, and because starting with Burl was the way Emmett had done it. And that was reason enough. Burl had a habit of turning his big head to watch her while she buckled the traces, as if he were confirming that she was still the same person she had been the season before. She always was. That mattered to him. The meeting in Auburn that April had been the Extension Office's annual production update, and Dale Pruitt had driven down from Lincoln with a laptop and a laser pointer and all the confidence of a man whose model had never failed in front of him. He was not a bad man. That is important to say and to mean. He held his position genuinely, with the rigor of someone who had spent 22 years reading the literature, running the trials, and watching the county averages climb whenever farmers followed the recommendations he offered. He believed in diesel efficiency the way a good engineer believes in load-bearing calculations, because the calculations had worked reliably across most of the situations he had been trained to measure. He was sincere. He was wrong in the way that sincerity sometimes is, which is wrong about what is being measured rather than wrong about the measurements themselves. After the meeting, several of the farmers in attendance stopped to chat with Dale near the coffee station. Glenn Failer, 55, who farmed to the north of Vera, said that he thought she was going to drive that old operation into the ground one of these years. Dale agreed, carefully, that it was a concern. Ruth Swanson, 62, who had known Vera since they were girls, said nothing to Dale about it at all. She drove home and called Vera that evening and told her what had been said, and said she thought Vera might want to know. Vera thanked her and said she already knew and that she was not worried about it. Ruth said she figured as much. They talked for a few more minutes about the weather and the spring planting, and then they said goodnight. Vera had been putting up with this kind of assessment for most of her adult life. She understood what it looked like from the outside. Her corn yielded 148 bushels per acre in an average year, against a county average of 172. Her equipment was old enough that the rust on the farmall had its own texture, a kind of topographic map of 25 Nebraska winters. Her harness rack held collars and hames that had been mended and oiled so many times the leather had taken on a color that had no name except use. Her horses required daily feeding, daily care, daily attention of the kind that a diesel tractor does not demand. She moved slowly across her fields by any modern standard. She did not have a GPS guidance system, a yield monitor, a variable rate application controller, or a climate-controlled cab. What she had was Burl and 5 other Belgians, a rebuilt 1940s cultivator frame, and 40 years of observation of a particular 180 acres of Nemaha County ground. Those 40 years had given her things that did not translate into slide decks. She knew the low corner of the south field drained 2 days slower than the rest after a heavy rain, and she adjusted her cultivation timing accordingly. She knew the west fence line had a strip of ground, 12 yards wide, where the soil ran sandier, and the cover crop mix needed a different seeding rate. She knew which rows the pocket gopher population worked in late summer, and adjusted her row spacing there by 2 inches to give herself a cleaner sweep. None of this knowledge was in a database. All of it was in her legs and her eyes and the 38 springs she had spent behind the same team on the same ground, watching it change by increments, so small that only continuous attention could have measured them. This was what Dale Pruitt, with his laptop and his laser pointer, did not have and could not buy. Let me tell you about that ground, and about what Vera understood of it, and why the column Dale Pruitt was reading was not the column that mattered. A Belgian draft horse in field condition weighs somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 pounds. When that horse steps on a field, its hoof exerts roughly 10 pounds of pressure per square inch against the soil. A modern row-crop tractor, the kind with the dual rear tires and the climate-controlled cab, puts 14 to 25 pounds per square inch on that same ground, depending on load and tire inflation. Soil is not inert. It is a structured material full of channels and pore spaces and microbial colonies and fungal threads that move water and gas and nutrients through the profile. When you crush those structures repeatedly with heavy equipment, you compact the layers below the tillage zone, into what agronomists call a hard pan, a dense, nearly impermeable stratum that roots cannot easily penetrate and water cannot easily pass. A compaction problem that takes a season to create can take a decade to undo. Vera's fields had not been driven over by a tractor for field work in 23 years. Her soil had not had time to forget how to breathe. The horses also fertilized as they worked. 6 Belgians on a long field day deposit roughly 60 pounds of manure in that field, broadcast across the surface without any additional pass or cost. Over a season, the team added organic matter and nitrogen that Vera never paid for, never hauled, and never applied. Her soil organic matter percentage, when the county tested it in 2018 at her request, was 4.1%. The county average for row crop ground in Nemaha was 2.3%. Higher organic matter holds more water, feeds more biology, and produces more stable yields in drought years. But none of that shows up on a yield per acre slide in a meeting hall, because the model is not built to measure it. The cultivation pass was where the system paid its most visible dividend. Vera worked her row crops with a 4-horse cultivator rig, a piece of equipment her father had rebuilt from a 1940s implement frame with new sweeps. Horses move at roughly 2 miles per hour in cultivation. That slow, even pace allows the cultivator's sweeps to track precisely along the row without throwing soil into the crop or missing the weed zone. The result was mechanical weed control accurate enough to eliminate, in Vera's case, the need for any pre-emergent or post-emergent herbicide application at all. No herbicide meant no herbicide cost, and in 2018 that had been roughly $31 per acre for corn ground in her township. It also meant her grain tested clean of herbicide residue, which turned out to matter in ways she had not yet fully understood. The feed self-sufficiency piece was the one Emmett had cared about most. Vera devoted 20 of her 180 acres to oats and hay production for the team. 6 horses at heavy work need roughly 20 pounds of hay and 10 pounds of grain per day each. Over a season, with appropriate rest and pasture grazing, the team's feed requirement was met almost entirely by those 20 acres, with a small grain purchase in hard forage years. The fuel for her tractors for hay baling and transport and the small diesel use she still maintained ran about $1,400 annually. Her neighbor, Marvin Schurer, farming 320 acres with a full diesel operation, spent $12,000 on fuel in an average year. The difference between those two numbers had been sitting in Emmett's ledger since 1971, growing patient as a seed. If you had listened to Dale Pruitt's presentation and looked at those yield curves, Vera's corn at 148 bushels per acre against the county average of 172, you would have understood why he said what he said. The model was not wrong about yield. The model was simply not looking at the right column. The column Dale was reading was gross output. The columns he was not reading were soil health, input cost, debt load, and price premium for grain that arrived at the elevator with a clean test, high organic content, and no synthetic chemistry behind it. He was reading the visible number and calling it the whole story, and Vera had long since stopped expecting that particular habit to change on its own. If you think someone in your own life has been reading the wrong column on something that matters, and you have been waiting for the right moment to say so, consider leaving a comment. It is a strange thing to do alone. The rest of the story is worth hearing. Her granddaughter, Carla, arrived in June of 2021 with an agronomy degree from the University of Nebraska and a quiet certainty that her grandmother needed help. Carla was 29, sharp and hardworking, and she loved Vera in the uncomplicated way of a person who has spent summers on a farm since childhood. She also believed in the clear and factual way her coursework had organized her thinking, that draft horses were not a competitive production system. She had studied input-output models. She had taken 2 semesters of precision agriculture. She had learned about yield monitors and variable rate technology and efficiency gains from GPS-guided equipment. She knew that Vera's corn yield was below the county average. She had done the math. She came, she told herself, to help. What that meant, privately, was that she came to ease her grandmother into something more rational before it became a problem. The first week, Carla spent mornings in the field with Vera and afternoons reviewing the books. The books confused her. The input costs were so low they read like errors. No herbicide line, no equipment loan service, fuel at $1,400 for the year, feed and farrier costs in place of diesel, and the feed costs were largely offset by the 20 acres of oats and hay. She checked the numbers twice. Then she sat with Vera at the kitchen table and said carefully that she understood the tradition and she respected it, but that the yield gap was real and the county average was the county average for a reason, and that maybe a conversation with the extension office might be worth having. Vera told her that Dale Pruitt had already had that conversation and that she had heard everything he had to say, and that she would keep her own counsel. She said it without heat. Then she told Carla to come out early the next morning because the corn needed its second cultivation pass. Carla came out. She walked the rows while Vera drove the 4-horse rig, and she watched the sweeps move through the soil at that deliberate 2-mile-an-hour pace, and she looked at the weed pressure between the rows, which was minimal, and she looked at the weed pressure in the untouched headland borders, which was substantial. She did not say anything. She was calculating something slowly that she did not have the full equation for yet. Marvin Schur, who farmed the 320 acres to Vera's east, had taken out a loan in the fall of 2020 to buy a new John Deere 9R Series tractor at a purchase price of just over $300,000. He was a good farmer and a decent man, the kind of neighbor who brought food when there was illness in a household and fixed fence with you when a storm knocked it down. He did not mock Vera's horses, though he had told her more than once that he worried about her. The tractor had made his spring work faster and his rows straighter, and his fuel cost in 2020 had been $11,800, which was in line with what he had budgeted. His corn yield that year was 79 bushels per acre, and his bean yield was 52, and by the numbers that a lender or a county agent would use, Marvin Schur was farming well. In the fall of 2020, Marvin had asked Dale Pruitt to stop by Vera's place and have a proper conversation about the operation. He framed it as concern. Dale drove out on a Tuesday in October, sat at the same kitchen table where Eric Lundqvist would later sit, and said that he thought of Vera's system as, in his phrase, a heritage hobby. He said the phrase with the same patient kindness he used for everything, which was the thing that made it cut exactly as deep as it did. He said the horses were a real piece of county history, and he meant no disrespect, but that in practical terms a hobby was what it was, and that she should consider whether the ground might be better served by a transition plan. He said he could help her think through options. Vera thanked him for his time and showed him out. Carla, who had been in the barn when Dale arrived and had listened to part of the conversation through the kitchen window, told Vera that evening that Dale had a point about the yield numbers. Vera said that Dale was measuring the wrong things. Carla said that yield was not the wrong thing to measure. Vera went to the kitchen drawer and took out Emmett's green ledger and set it on the table between them and said, "Read the years 1973 and 1979, and then tell me what the wrong thing is." Those were the years of the oil embargo and the second energy crisis, the years when diesel had doubled in price and then doubled again, and Emmett had recorded his neighbor's cost alongside his own in his careful, narrow columns. Carla read those pages in silence. The numbers told a story that her coursework had not prepared her to read. Then she went to bed without saying anything more, and Vera noted that she had not left the ledger on the table. The spring of 2022 came in dry across Nemaha County. By April, the soil moisture readings were already below average, and the Extension Office was forecasting a difficult summer. The subsoil moisture was depleted from the previous year's late-season dry spell, and the forecast models pointed toward a hot July. The more immediate pressure, the one nobody in the county had modeled for, arrived in the fuel market. The disruptions that had been building through the previous year, the supply chain pressure, and the energy shock spreading outward from the war in Ukraine, and the slow unspooling of pandemic-era logistics hit the diesel retail price in the Midwest like a door blown open in March. By May, diesel was $4.20 at the co-op pump. By June, it was $5.40. That April, just before the fuel price broke through, Dale Pruitt had been present at a cattle transfer at the sale barn in Auburn and had run into Glenn Failer and Ruth Swanson, two of the farmers Vera had known since childhood. The conversation had turned, as it often did in that circle, to Vera and her horses. Dale had said, in the easy register of a man summarizing a long-held view, that the operation out on Vera's place was a living museum. He said he held it in affection, genuinely, but that a living museum was what it was, and that the county's actual farmers had work to do and could not afford sentiment. Glenn Failer had laughed. Ruth Swanson had not. She had looked at Dale for a moment, then looked at the cattle moving through the ring, and said that she would wait and see. Dale had taken that as mild disagreement. It was something closer to a forecast. Marvin Schure's fuel budget for 2022 had been built at $2.80 per gallon. He had expected to spend roughly $12,000. He had not hedged his fuel purchase. By the end of June, with planning done and the first cultivation pass ahead of him, he had already spent $17,000 on diesel, and the summer work had not yet begun. He did the arithmetic on the back of a billing envelope one evening in early July, and the number he arrived at, for the year's fuel alone, was $29,120. Against a 320-acre operation carrying a $300,000 equipment note at a fixed annual service cost, that figure meant calling the bank. He called the bank. The conversation was polite and not particularly encouraging. In mid-July of 2022, Marvin drove his truck down Vera's lane and knocked. He did not look comfortable. He sat in the kitchen and explained the numbers, which Vera already knew because she had watched him plant in May and had done the arithmetic herself. He said he could not afford the fuel for his fall tillage pass and his cover crop planting work, and that he was wondering, and he understood it was a strange question, whether the Belgians were available to work his ground for hire. Vera said they were. She named a day rate per team horse. He agreed to it without negotiating. She sent Burl's hitch out over his fields the following week, with Carla handling the left lines and Vera on the right, and they worked 320 acres in 11 days. Marvin walked the field road in the evenings and watched. He had never seen his own ground worked at horse pace, had never stood at the end of a row and felt the quiet that falls when the engine is not running, and he was not sure at first what to make of it. On the fourth day, he walked to where Vera was turning the hitch and said that the horses seemed to know what they were doing. Vera said they had been doing it longer than he had been farming. He laughed, a genuine laugh, and she gave him a short nod and brought the hitch around. Carla did not speak much during those 11 days. She was watching something she had not expected to see, which was neighbors stopping their trucks at the field road and getting out to look. Not to mock, to look. Glenn Failer leaned on his hood for an hour on the third day, watching the team work a cultivation row. And when Vera came to the end of the field and turned the hitch, he took off his cap and held it in both hands for a moment before he put it back on and drove away. Carla asked Vera that evening what Glenn had been thinking. Vera said she did not know. Then she said that he was counting. She said it quietly, and Carla understood that she did not mean the furrows. The rains that had stayed away all summer arrived in September in a concentrated burst that turned Marvin's tillage ground into sheets of surface runoff. Vera's fields, with their higher organic matter and their uncompacted profile, held the water. The contrast was visible from the road. 3 inches of rain in 48 hours, and Marvin's east field ran off into the creek, while Vera's ground drank it in and went quiet. Carla stood at the fence line between the two properties in the rain for a long time, long enough that her jacket was soaked through. She was looking at the soil color. She was thinking about the numbers on those ledger pages from 1973 and 1979. She was thinking about $2.80 per gallon and what the model had assumed and what the model had failed to model. She went back inside and asked Vera to show her the hitch from the beginning. If you had been watching from a distance, the winter of 2022 into 2023 would have looked unremarkable on the Holst place. The horses were in their barn, the fields were dormant. An older woman and a younger woman moved around the place with the steady, unhurried efficiency of people who know what needs doing. What you could not have seen from a distance was Carla, in the harness room every evening after supper, memorizing the names and placements of every piece of equipment in the order it was used, learning the hitch order, learning which horse needed what cue, which of Burl's signals meant a loose trace and which meant he had simply decided something nearby was worth examining. She spent 1 full week doing nothing but harnessing and unharnessing, with Vera watching from the doorway and saying almost nothing, which meant she was doing it correctly. She began keeping a notebook, not Emmett's ledger, but her own, parallel to it. On its first page, she wrote the words, "Second cultivation pass," and then the date and the weather and the weed pressure she had observed. On the second page, she wrote, "Soil organic matter," what it actually does, and worked out, from the extension literature she ordered and the soil science she had been taught in Lincoln, the mechanism behind every number in Emmett's column. She did not show it to Vera. She did not need to. Eric Lundqvist arrived on a Wednesday in June of 2023, driving a rental truck with a South Dakota plate. He was 61 years old, operations director for the Prairie Heritage Grain Cooperative, a regional buyer that had been building a premium grain program for 3 years by seeking out low input and no synthetic producers across the northern plains. A colleague at a land-grant extension conference in Ames had mentioned Vera's name, and Eric had done his homework before making the drive. He was a methodical man, trained as an agronomist before he moved into grain buying, and he understood soil the way a buyer has to understand it, which is as something that produces flavor and resilience and test weight and market premium rather than simply as the medium that holds up plants. He walked the fields first without speaking much. carrying a soil probe he had brought himself. He crouched at the edge of a corn row and crumbled a clod between his fingers and looked at it for a long time, turning it in his palm and checking the color and the structure and the smell of it. Then he stood and asked Vera how long the horses had been working this ground without a tractor pass for tillage. She told him 38 years. He nodded once, slowly, as though this confirmed a calculation he had already been running in his head on the drive down. At the kitchen table, he spread out the co-op's certification requirements. No synthetic herbicide for 7 years prior. Documented low-input production history. Clean grain test for pesticide residue. Minimum soil organic matter threshold of 3.5%. Vera's ground cleared every one of those lines by a considerable margin. He went through the quality test results from the grain she had delivered to the local elevator the previous fall, and he said, in the level tone of a man reading a document he had already evaluated before he arrived, that her grain qualified for the co-op's Heritage Premium Program. He said that the premium price for the following harvest delivery was $8.40 per bushel. He said the co-op would take her full production. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Carla had been standing at the counter and she had stopped moving. Vera asked him to read the price again. $8.40 per bushel. The county commodity price that summer was $5.20. Vera's 160 planted acres. She had fallowed 20 that year for a cover crop rotation, had come in at 52 bushels per acre. The arithmetic was simple enough that Carla did it while Eric was still setting his folder straight. She wrote the number on the corner of the notepad by the telephone, $69,888 gross. Then she subtracted the real costs. No fuel for field work, no herbicide, no equipment debt service, seed and minimal inputs. She arrived at $62,400 in net margin and set the pen down. $62,400. On 180 acres, with a team of horses and 20 acres of oats. She said the number aloud, quietly, almost to herself. Eric Lundqvist nodded once and said that was correct. He said it without any particular emphasis, the way a man reads a figure that was always going to be right, because it was built on facts that had been accumulating for 38 years. He closed his folder and accepted the coffee Vera offered him, and sat for a while at the table without needing to say anything more. Burl was visible through the window, standing at the near pasture gate with his head up, watching them through the glass with the patient, disinterested authority of a horse that has never needed to prove anything to anyone. Carla stood at the counter for a while after Eric had driven off, and she did not speak, and Vera did not ask her to. What Carla was doing in the silence was not celebration. She was revising. She was revising the 4 years she had spent arriving at what she thought she knew about farming and placing them next to the 38 years Vera had spent arriving at what she actually knew. And she was feeling the difference between those two lengths of time in a way that no coursework had prepared her to feel. She had learned about soil organic matter from a textbook. Vera had built it under her feet. She had run the input-output models on a screen. Vera had run them in the ground, one season at a time, without the vocabulary that would have made the results legible to a credentialed committee. The number on that notepad, $62,400, was not new information. It was old information, finally rendered in a language the market could hear. That was all the difference, and it was all the difference in the world. Dale Pruitt drove out in October. He had heard from Marvin, who had heard from the elevator manager, who had heard the price per bushel and done his own arithmetic. Dale came without a clipboard in his personal truck rather than the university vehicle. He wore jeans and a plain jacket instead of the university fleece. He stood at the field edge for a long time after Vera walked him out there, looking at the cover crop she had seeded behind the harvest, looking at the color and the texture and the life in the soil she had exposed, where she turned a small shovelful at the headland. He looked at the fence line where his models had ended, and the actual ground had quietly continued doing what it was built to do. Then he turned to her and said, "I got the mechanism wrong." He did not say it as an apology exactly. He said it the way a person states a fact they have finished arguing with. He said he had read the yield and called it the margin, and those were not the same thing, and he should have known that. He asked whether she would be willing to explain the cultivation timing, the way she managed weed pressure without a herbicide pass. Vera looked at him for a moment. Then she said that she would, and they walked the headland for an hour while she explained it. He was not a bad man. He had never been a bad man. He had simply been trained to read one column and call it the whole ledger. He came out twice more that fall and once in the spring, and by the second visit he had stopped bringing anything to take notes with, and had started just walking alongside Vera and listening. He wrote a short item in the county extension newsletter the following winter about low-input heritage grain premiums and the agronomic logic of horse-drawn cultivation. He did not mention Vera by name because she had asked him not to, but he described the soil organic matter data and the weed pressure results and the economics of the premium program with the care of a man who had recently understood something he should have understood years earlier and was making a partial amends in the only way available to him. That fall, Vera taught Glenn Feeler's son to drive the 4-horse cultivator rig on his family's 20-acre truck crop ground. Glenn stood at the field edge watching, and this time he did not take his cap off. He put both hands in his pockets and looked at his son, managing the lines, and nodded once in a way that was not about the son at all, but about the 20 years of cultivation passes he had spent burning diesel on ground that was growing harder each season under the weight of his equipment. He did not say anything about that because Glenn Feller was not a man who said that kind of thing out loud. He hired Vera's team the following spring for his own Northfield, and he told Marvin about the cover crop results he saw that fall, and Marvin told 2 other neighbors, and by the following planting season, Vera had more work contracted than she could take on with 6 horses. She told Carla they would need to bring in 2 more from the breeding program she had been running quietly on the side. Ruth Swanson called in November and asked whether Vera would be willing to breed a pair of her Belgian mares and sell her a young team to start with in 2 years. Vera said she would. She said she had been waiting for that call for about 10 years. Ruth laughed and said she wished she had made it sooner. Vera said that was usually how it went. Marvin Sure sold the big John Deere back to the dealer at a loss and bought a smaller used tractor for road work and hay baling. He contracted with Vera's team for his field cultivation. He ran his fuel cost back down to $3,800 for the year against a 320-acre operation that was beginning slowly to show the kind of soil structure it would have had if he had started 30 years earlier. He called it the best business decision he had made in a decade. He said it over coffee on a Tuesday morning, and Vera said it sounded about right. Carla refilled his cup and said nothing, because she had learned that from Vera, and it was a useful skill. Carla Holst took over field operations in the spring of 2024. She ran the hitch herself, starting with Burl, who was patient with her in the way of an animal that has worked long enough to have his own opinions about who is worth the effort. He turned his big head while she buckled the traces, just as he had done with Vera and with Emmett before Vera, confirming in his private way that she was still the same person she had been the morning before. She always was. He seemed to find that acceptable. She had updated the Green Ledger system to a fresh notebook by then, cross-referencing Emmett's cost columns with her own, adding the organic matter data and the premium price history and the cultivation timing charts she had developed from 2 winters of close observation. She had added a soil compaction table comparing the PSI figures she had found in the agronomic literature against the measurements she had taken herself with a penetrometer she borrowed from the extension office. She had added a section on cover crop selection for the sandy loam sections of the far field, where the drainage ran different and the organic matter built more slowly. On the inside front cover of her notebook, in handwriting not unlike her great-grandfather's, she wrote the sentence from Emmett's original ledger. Then she added a line below it, which was her own. The method is not a memory. It is a decision made every spring. She handed Emmett's original green ledger to Vera on the evening before she ran her first full cultivation pass alone. Vera set it on the kitchen table and did not open it. She rested her hand on the cover for a moment, the way you rest your hand on something that has already said everything it needs to say. Then she told Carla to get some sleep, because the early hitch required a steady pair of hands and a rested mind, and both of those were things you could not borrow. Outside in the April twilight, Burl stood in the near pasture, with his head up, watching the last light go. He had been working this ground for 16 years. He would work it for a few more, and then the younger horses would work it, and the ground would remember none of the names and all of the weight, laid gently, season after season, the way patient work accumulates into something a model cannot quite see until the column. It was never reading is finally read aloud in a kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon. There are 2 ways to know a piece of ground. One of them arrives with a degree and a projection and a set of assumptions about what efficiency means and what a system is allowed to cost. It is confident and teachable and good at moving quickly. The other way is slower. It accumulates across seasons and ledgers and early mornings in a harness room, and it knows things the first way cannot see, because it has been paying attention to the right columns since before the model existed. The first way is not wrong in the sense of being dishonest. It is wrong in the sense of being incomplete, and that incompleteness goes undetected until something outside the model, a fuel market, a drought year, a soil probe held by a man who knows what he is looking for, measures what the model left out. The structural shock that settles these arguments is never personal and never cruel. It is arithmetic run at a time horizon longer than the next quarter, across columns the model was not built to read. What is rigid inside a single cost assumption breaks when that assumption fails. What is built from what you grow and what you can control holds, because its resilience was never a feature the market offered. It was a fact the ground already knew. Emmett Holst understood this in 1955 when he watched his neighbors sell their teams and write their first equipment checks, and he recorded it in a green ledger in handwriting that would outlast the machinery it was measuring. Vera Holst understood it in the way that a person understands a thing they have never had to argue for, because the ground beneath their feet simply was the argument, season after season, without noise or announcement. And Carla Holst understood it on a rainy September afternoon at a fence line in Nemaha County, watching one field run off and the other one hold, and feeling for the first time the full weight of what it meant to have been reading the right columns all along without knowing what they were called. What the soil remembers, the horse taught it.